Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss a comment that Labour leader Keir Starmer made about the prospect of forming coalitions after the next general election, how the quote itself that people are sharing is actually incorrect, and how regardless of what was meant, it's sort of a waste of effort to complain about something that has no impact on the progressive movement in the country until after a general election. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So not really going to defend or attack the statement from Starmer here, because essentially the statement that's been shared is incorrect. So from that point of view, I'm going to be defending what was said. But at the same time, maybe the way it was said, you need to be a bit more careful. For most of us, if we say something and it's in a particular context and we can say statements that people understand because, well, they're the audience. But sometimes if people clip what you say and just present it as is, it can appear to mean something different. But anyway, my first introduction to this was via social media post with the quote from Starmer, "There will be no coalition before or after the general election." So as you do, you take it at face value. What, he's saying no. What? It was being widely shared at the end of the day. How can they say there'll be no coalition? They're not going to win a supermajority or anything. But it turns out the quote is misleading. But I'll get onto that later. Let's just take the quote to mean what people took it to mean at the time. That Starmer will not countenance any coalition with any party after general election, which is not what he said, by the way, even if that's the only way to displace the Conservatives. Are you crazy? The thing about a coalition is that, of course, people are going to be thinking about it because it's not credible that Labour win a working majority unless something really, really unexpected happens. They would need the largest swing in history, and they don't have the funds to target that many seats. Labour is not in a great financial position, and even if it were, it's still not feasible to get enough staff to target that many seats. But you also can't promise to form a coalition after a general election, and there are two main reasons why. The first is, so let's do my old favourite mathematical tool, the proof by contradiction. So let's assume that they did do that. Let us assume that they said ahead of the general election, we're going to form a coalition with the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party. We're forming this massive electoral pact. We're going to support each other in the election, and then we're going to form a government together afterwards. Great. Now, let's say Labour win 340 seats. They won't, but let's just say. You need about 320 for a majority, remember. Let's say the Liberal Democrats win 30 seats and the Green Party win 10 seats. You know, their support of each other is so great that they displace the Conservatives because you haven't got vote splitting going on in these places anymore. That would be a beast of a coalition. However, there is then the question of the balance of power. Although all three parties want rid of the Conservatives and will support each other to do that, they are still three different parties with three different ideas about how to govern. Otherwise, they wouldn't be three different parties, would they? So people in Labour, who would actually have enough seats to govern alone, might query why the leadership is giving policy making over to two parties with such a small number of MPs. Why are you including them in your government? You don't need to. It would be a nonsense. A coalition is an agreement that you negotiate once you know what the lay of the land is, once you know what the results are. And then the second reason touches on what the quote was really about, because the quote, as I say, is misleading. Starmer didn't rule out forming a coalition at all. The quote from that point of view is wrong. He ruled out forming a coalition specifically with the SNP. Now, this is important and not just a sensible policy. There's no choice other than to have this policy. First of all, Labour lost votes in the last two general elections because of the fear, in England and Wales at any rate, that Labour might form a coalition with the SNP. The Conservatives pushed that fear very, very hard. And why is it a fear? Because the SNP wants Scotland to become independent, of course. They don't just want another referendum on the issue. They want that referendum under the circumstances that gives them the best chance of success. It's not a criticism, that's their main policy. But that's not Labour's policy. If Labour were to win power, so let's say now from this point of view, So Labour were to win power and Starmer said, OK, we could form an effective coalition with the SNP. You know, what then? What then? What price for that? Well, the SNP would want a referendum. The Labour Party would be fine with the referendum to test the will of the people, but under what conditions? You see, what Starmer would want to do is to win over Scottish voters first by introducing the reforms he wants to do for the non-English nations for real devolution. It's a shame he also hasn't got plans at the moment for English devolution, but that's a thorny issue. You know, so devolution of the sort that Westminster won't be able to pull back with another dodgy Prime Minister like Johnson in the future. He will also want to implement that before asking the Scottish people whether they wish to remain or to leave. The SNP want the opposite of that. At the moment, of course, quite happy to wait a bit with the next referendum, a year or two. Nicola Sturgeon, who I think has been quite canny, has said she just wants that referendum before the next general election. Basically by 2024. Because as long as Johnson is in charge, they're only gaining more support. Why would you go for an early referendum when your support is growing? If Labour were to form a government, however, well, all those pressures that are causing that rise in support, quite a lot of them go away. Socially responsible, competent governance and further devolution will reduce the need for independence to get what some want from it. The idea of a Labour SNP coalition is a complete non-starter because they are completely opposed on this one issue. And this one issue, of course, is the SNP's raison d'etre. It is the thing that they will insist is part of any electoral pact. So Labour would demand the next referendum to be after the reforms, still in this parliament, or that parliament, but after the reforms. And it would be politically stupid of the SNP to go along with that. Why would they go along with that? And I know that assumes that there hasn't already been another referendum by this point. Before people start posting the comments, it's probably already too late. But that's what we're talking about. If there were another referendum before the next general election, the issue becomes completely irrelevant anyway. So what we have here is a misquote. Starmer hasn't ruled out a coalition to form a progressive government at all. He's just ruled out forming one with the SNP. The people who are accusing Starmer of throwing away the next election have been taken in by a misquote and also placing too much importance on coalition planning before you even know the numbers. Because even if he had said that, she hadn't, who cares? It's irrelevant until after the election. In addition, this is not a blow for the Progressive Alliance. Remember, Keir Starmer, very recently, in the last couple of weeks, when he was asked about this, refused to rule it out. Refused to rule it out for the next election. I know it's a bit frustrating for some that he hasn't already thrown his weight positively behind it. But now that the by-elections have been navigated, there is no rush to do that. A progressive alliance does nothing right now, has no effect right now. It doesn't give them more power in Parliament. And bear in mind that this is like Labour's version, effectively, the SNP's independence referendum. The longer they wait, the more support there is for it. Support for issues like proportional representation and progressive alliance, which there's always been a fair amount of resistance to in Labour, they are growing. Support is growing in the party. But, when you look through Labour forums, there's now quite a lot of support for proportional representation. I don't really see too many comments against it, but there is still vocal resistance to the progressive alliance. Starmer is likely just biding his time until support is more mainstream. Look, the reality is this. Let us say Keir Starmer's strategists are advising him that a progressive alliance is not on the cards. We're sunk anyway. If that's the quality of his strategists, we are basically buggered. We all know that Labour cannot win the next election outright. The maths just isn't there to support it. That's just a fact. That means that if we displace the Conservatives, it will be either a minority Labour government who governs on a case-by-case basis with other parties, or one in coalition with someone else. Really that simple. And Labour will work with whomever they need to in order to stop the Conservatives governing. It just won't come at the cost of breaking up the UK, that's all. They won't seek to block a Scottish independence referendum as the Conservatives are, but they also don't have to let the SNP trigger it under their terms. That's really all this statement is about. So Labour ruling out that coalition with the SNP isn't throwing away the election, it's giving them a chance. Because if they didn't scotch the rumours, sorry for the pun, actually not sorry, then they, that they might work with the SNP. The Tories would push that. It was such a huge factor, especially in 2017. They really pushed it, but they also pushed it in 2019 as well. It was such a fear factor that a vote for Labour is a vote for the SNP to get into government in Westminster, and a vote for that is a vote for the breakup of the UK. Cannot even begin to describe the impact of people believing that they would be voting for the breakup of the UK. Yes, I know a load of them did with Brexit, but they didn't. That wasn't anticipated, not by them at any rate. Put simply, Labour cannot form a coalition with the SNP after the general election because the SNP's price would be too high. It's totally opposite. Even if they both agree, if there hasn't been a referendum by then, they both agree, well, there's clearly a will amongst the Scottish people for a referendum. They won't agree on how to do it because each side will want the odds stacked in their favour. That's politics. So they cannot entertain the notion before a general election because one side, it's like a zero-sum game. One side would have to lose. Well, Labour can't because they'd be the largest party in this government, so why would they concede too much power? But if the SNP don't get that at least, then they'll look as silly as the Lib Dems did in 2010. But he also said at the same time, because again, people are just looking at one little quote taken out of context, there was more to it. He did say he was willing to work with the SNP on areas of common interest, like the climate emergency. Now think about what that means. Just that statement, the fact that he said he'd be willing to work, or in fact want to work with the SNP on areas like climate legislation, what does that mean? What does that statement mean? It means he recognises that legislation with him as Prime Minister is going to need cooperation between different parties because he won't have the MPs to push a purely Labour-centric agenda. All he's saying is that the SNP won't be deciding policy in government, but that they will be involved in influencing policy of common interest because they'll have to be because he won't have enough MPs. He knows that. Labour cannot rule out a coalition with others because you never can without knowing what the results of an election are. And finally, and this is the really important point, Starmer has not ruled out forming a coalition with the Lib Dems or the Greens or both, and he has not ruled out a progressive alliance. Quite frankly, I am working on the assumption that some form of alliance is very much part of the plan. At the very least, standing candidates down for each other. That has to be part of the plan, but they're not ready to announce it yet. And that assumption is not without foundation, because everything they are doing and saying suggests that some form of pact will indeed be in place for the next election. You have a party leader refusing to rule it out. Well, refusing to rule something out is often political language for, of course we're going to do it, we just don't want to admit it just yet. Some of his advisors are also the same people who helped form the pact that Labour formed with the Lib Dems last time they won power. The very idea that Labour are planning to go it alone is utterly ridiculous. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.